Alrighty, so this is going to be the second part of Chapter 3. This part is going to talk largely about the slave economy and how does that develop. Alright, so the South Atlantic system, that is going to be largely centered in Brazil and the West Indies, and their primary product is sugar, and I think I mentioned that in previous lectures. It grows really well in the Caribbean and in Brazil and places like that, and it is a high export. It makes a lot of money, and so it is worthwhile to produce it. The Europeans provided the tools and the equipment. The slave labor is going to make the plantations both productive and profitable, because again, with slave labor, you are not paying as much money as you would a labor worker or an indentured servant even. You are getting more bang for your buck, per se. So, the English are going to begin plantation economies in the West Indian colonies later than other nations. A lot of that's going to have to do with Elizabeth dealing with Spain and the Spanish Armada and all of that good stuff. They don't even move over into North America until 1607. So it is going to be much later. Early settlers had small-scale farms with indentured servants. After 1650, production of sugar is going to change Barbados and other islands into slave-based plantation societies. And that is going to slowly change in the 19th century, largely. Wealthy men owned sugar plantations with scores of slaves. Sugar was the most profitable crop in Europe or the Americas. Because again, not only is it utilized in food and whatnot, it's utilized in the making of rum. Huge profits are going to flow into Britain from the slave trade. They have guns, iron, rum, and cloth are traded for slaves who produced far more profit than they had cost. Slaves sold in the West Indies for 3 to 5 times what they cost in Africa. So that alone is a profitable business. To go purchase slaves in Africa, transport them over to the so-called New World, and sell them for triple or 5 times the amount that they bought them for. The sugar production and slave trade commerce stimulates all aspects of the British economy, including the Royal Navy. So even that is going to increase because of these trades, because the British Navy is going to be out in force protecting their shipping interest. And that will become the largest navy in the world. All right, so this is the number of Africans arriving alive in the Americas and Europe. So approximately 14% are going to die on slave ships. I'll show you some pictures in a minute, but I'm sure you've probably seen a lot of what I'm about to show you. So you should be familiar with kind of how they're transported over. You will also notice the largest number of slaves that are coming to the Americas are going to Brazil. 3.6 million versus 500,000 in British North America, 500,000 in Dutch America. So we really only have about 1 million slaves that are hitting North American soil, as far as the colonies and things are concerned. You have almost over 3 million going to the West Indies. Spanish Central America, that's going to be Mexico, and in that area, 1.5 million. And you have a small number going to Europe as well, especially Portugal and whatnot. All right, so as I have mentioned before, slavery was rooted in African history for a much longer time than just when they started selling slaves to Europeans. They have these historic roots in Africa. You have warring nations that war with each other. They capture people from the other kingdoms and tribes, and they keep them as slaves, and eventually they will begin selling them. European trade made enslaving people a way of life. Conquering regions and then selling people as slaves is highly profitable for kings. Yet participation in the transatlantic slave trade remains a choice, not a necessity. So they choose to do this. It's not that they have to do it to earn money. They choose to. Hundreds of thousands of young Africans are going to die, and millions more endure a brutal life of slavery in the Americas. 2/3 of those enslaved were men. Marriage practices changed in Western Africa as a result of the scarcity of men. So you can just imagine what that would be like. But why would we have 2/3 of them being men? Well, the reason is those are going to be the ones who are going to work the fields. A man can obviously often lift more, work longer hours. They're not giving birth to children. And so there's very definite benefits to having a larger portion of men. That will change later. You will start having more women as the Americans realize that they can kind of produce their own slaves through birth. All right, so these people are torn from villages, and they are often marched in chains, like literally chained to each other, to coastal ports. So they are coming from the interiors of Africa. They're packed in hideously overcrowded ships. They're shackled. They're subjected to starvation, dehydration, feces, urine, vomit. Roughly 1 in 10 voyages had a violent slave rebellion. More than 1 million died of disease or illness en route to the Americas. And then if you survived, you still had a 10-hour workday to look forward to, poor living conditions, insufficient food, and for women, there were times of sexual abuse as well. Okay, so this is a map of slave importation areas into the New World. This is basically a map of what the chart just told us. But this is where they're coming from. So you can see the areas that they're coming from. The slave coast in particular, 2 million. You've got them coming all the way down the coast of Africa too. So again, and you can see with the arrows of where they're coming from. They are not stripping people from coastal areas and selling them. That would be too easy. That would be not too easy, but too difficult, because they're going to have people nearby that might come to collect them. However, if you march them from the interior to the coast, you're going to have a lot less chance that somebody is going to try and come and collect their people. All right. This is a very popular view of a ship packed with slaves. How accurate this is, I don't know, but it is the traditional representation of how packed a slave ship would be. Okay, so the Middle Passage, this is the journey of African slaves that they endure on ships as they're brought from Africa to the New World. Notoriously overcrowded and filthy. Mortality rate among Africans is very high, especially for younger kids, and they don't usually take elderly people. It's going to be people that are healthy and ready to work, or able to work, maybe not ready, able. And this image is painted kind of as if the artist is there with the slaves. The African passengers don't look miserable, sick, or malnourished. The artist, a ship's officer, might have been seeking to minimize the brutality of the trip. So this is very different than this image that we see here. All right. This is more like we're hanging out on our trip. And this is going to be from the perspective of a ship's officer. So that's going to be very different. All right. Okay. So how do we get this slave economy in the colonies? So elite planter politicians led a tobacco revolution. So they take advantage of the slave trade to bring Africans into the region after Bacon's rebellion. Slavery is now defined in racial terms because the slaves are coming from Africa where people are darker skinned. Virginia prohibited sexual relations between English and Africans. Better living and working conditions than in the West Indies. Partially, tobacco plantations, a little bit easier work than a sugar plantation, which is easier work than a cotton plantation. So you're going to have a little bit better working and living condition. Tobacco profits are lower in the Chesapeake than sugar in the West Indies. So many tobacco planters encouraged slaves to have children to increase the workforce. And by the mid-18th century, more than 3/4 of the enslaved workers in the Chesapeake were American-born. And as time goes on, actually, by the time the Civil War happens, most slaves in the United States, or in the colonies, well, that's in the United States. By the time the Civil War happens, most slaves in the United States are native-born Americans. And this is going to really start happening as they are encouraging families and children to be born. Slaves labored under much harsher working conditions in South Carolina than they did in the Chesapeake. The colony is going to grow slowly. Production and export of rice helped increase profits. So first off, you have different type of land in South Carolina. Swampland, it's very dangerous, it's exhausting. They're producing rice, and if you don't know anything about rice production, part of it is you have to flood the fields. So you're going to have a lot of water involved. Mosquito-borne illnesses are going to kill a large number of slaves, because when you are working in those kinds of conditions, you're very susceptible to mosquito bites and just the growth of the mosquito population. All right, so this is a painting or an illustration of an English tobacco label. So this is what they would put on their products. So you can see the three Englishmen up in the front, kind of sampling their products, looks like right there. And back in the back, you have the African workers who are working the fields. You can see they have fancy clothes and wigs and shoes, suggesting that they are wealthy, they are relaxing, and enjoying their tobacco. The African slaves are seen as performing the labor. So this label, it was affixed to tobacco imported to London, and it clearly states its origin was London's Virginia. The label demonstrates that Virginia was a British economic satellite, that its colonists produced the tobacco sold in England and consumed English products such as wigs, cloth, buttons, buckles, etc. So even though it's being made over here in the colonies, it's getting over to Great Britain, and you can see they look like the British, and so therefore it's a British product. All right. Okay. So planters wanted an ethnically diverse Africans, and the reason they want this is to deter slave rebellions. When you're getting them initially, they speak their native languages, and so they're not going to have the commonalities with each other if they speak different languages and things like that. So numerous languages are spoken. Some of the planters do have preferences. They believe that slaves from certain areas of Africa were harder workers. Friendships and marriages across ethnic lines blur the clan or family affiliations that Africans brought. Common language helped grow a sense of community among slaves. So Gula or English or French. So they start learning different languages and things. Many of them have different religions, Muslim, other religious beliefs. We talked about the idea that many Africans believed in animism. So this is going to continue while cultural practices such as ritual scarring or country markings begin to disappear. So their cultural aspects and what identifies them to their particular tribe or kingdom are going to start to disappear over time. Let's see, slaves were denied education, the accumulation of material possessions, and the right to associate with others. So every slave owner was a little different, and every slave owner allowed different things. But these are generalizations, so just keep that in mind. Let's see, punishments. So for not doing what you're supposed to do include whipping and other forms of physical torture, removal of toes. White violence is lower in northern colonies than there were fewer slaves. Poor whites were hired to patrol southern colonies at night for runaway slaves. So slaves are going to resist in various ways. And you know, the big question is, why don't they get up and rebel? Well, you're in a foreign country. Things are unfamiliar. You're living with a bunch of people you don't really know, especially early on. And it's difficult. It's difficult to create a rebellion under those conditions. So they would resist in other ways. They'd run away. They'd barter for extra food and privileges. They would work slowly. They would steal. Some of them would fake sick, that kind of stuff. So therefore, outright rebellion is very rare. However, in 1739, you do have the Stono Rebellion. This happens in South Carolina, and it is the largest slave uprising in the mainland colonies. The Catholic governor of Spanish Florida instigates the revolt by promising freedom to runaway slaves. So Spain has no love lost for the English, and so they're going to promise them freedom if they get down to Florida. So people are going to start trying to escape and getting to Florida. When the war breaks out between England and Spain, this is going to be the French an Indian War that'll happen in 1754. Oh no, England and Spain. No, that'll happen earlier. 75 Africans led a revolt near the Stono River. So as England and Spain are having conflicts, you have runaway slaves and all this kind of stuff, you have Africans leading a revolt. So this is a well-armed mounted force of South Carolina militia, which is going to quell the Stono rebels by killing 44 slaves to suppress the rebellion. So frightened South Carolinians are going to cut slave imports, and they are going to tighten plantation discipline. So things are going to get worse for slaves in South Carolina, and this is going to start to lead up to that impression we have of slavery, which in the southern states is way more accurate than it is in the northern states. These are mechanisms used to control slaves. I can promise you none of you want those on your bodies. All right. Virginian luxuries. So you can see this is quite an interesting image here. So you've got the white man beating the African slaves. You can see he's got a whip, and you have him also kind of kissing and smooching on the female slave. So the southern planter and slave owner, both the man and the woman are slaves. The slave owner would often, I can't even say often, there are many occurrences where a slave owner would sexually abuse the black women, and they would abuse their slaves. Again, this is not going to be all slave owners. This is not going to be the norm per se. On the larger plantations, this will happen, but you also have a lot of kind slave owners. Not that, it's really hard to explain, and we can have this conversation more in depth in class if you're interested, but it's not a good situation for slaves, quite obviously. Nobody wants to be owned by somebody else, but not all slave owners were bad people. Not all of them abused their slaves, so I really don't want you to get a misimpression of it. Some people owned slaves because they didn't feel like they had a choice not to. Thomas Jefferson will fall into that category, and he will have a lot of slaves. So, I mean, there's a lot more to it than slave owners were white and they were bad people and Africans were the victim. So there's a lot more into it, and unfortunately the Africans are the victim in this case, and that is almost always true. Nobody volunteers to be a slave. This artist is going to create this image to call attention to the way slave owners mistreated their slaves, and also critique and perhaps ridicule these practices. It's going to clearly say that this is occurring in Virginia. It's calling it Virginia luxury. But the artist remains anonymous, so we don't know who painted that. All right. So you have William Byrd II. That's the lovely, handsome fellow right there with his lovely hairdo. I know we all want to look like that. He is a son of a successful planter merchant in Virginia. He is educated in England. So he is rejected by Englishmen and women as a colonial. However, he does accumulate great wealth, and he becomes a success in America, not in England. And that is going to be a very interesting dichotomy that will continue on. So you can be a very wealthy American, but you are not of the noble class. So in England, they're not going to think very highly of you. So it's kind of like that idea of old money versus new money. So just because you're rich, wealthy, and famous here in the Americas does not mean you are... That's your situation in England as well. His experience, William Byrd II, mirrors many Southern planter merchants trapped by their inferior colonial status, and they're going to use their wealth to rule over white Yemen, so farmers and tenant farmers, and rely on violence to exploit their enslaved blacks. So a lot of times that violence is going to occur because of basically an inferiority complex. And I'm better than you because you are a slave and I am not. I have a lot of money. After Bacon's rebellion, the elite are going to want to stop any possible uprising by poor whites. They are going to lower taxes in Virginia. They're going to cultivate gentility, which is a refined but elaborate lifestyle. Men are going to follow the traditional notions of English life, but they're going to live that life in America. And they're going to model themselves on the behavior of the English aristocracy, although most of them are not part of that. They are going to aim for success in the colonies. Parents had daughters tutored to make them more desirable as wives. And they would tutor women in all kinds of things, classical languages and things like that, but also in needlepoint and running a household and things like that. Women deferred to their husbands on all matters. And social networks become very important, especially the further south that you go. So that is going to be the end of our discussion of slavery at this point in time, and we will get into it way more as the semester progresses, especially as we get close to the Civil War. So one more section left in this chapter. It's not very long, so I will speak to you then. Hope you have a great afternoon, evening, or morning.